In the quiet town of West Pittston, Pennsylvania, in the early 1980s, there stood a house that would become infamous in the annals of paranormal history. The Smurl family, Jack, Janet, and their 3 children, had no idea that the suburban house they moved into in 1973 would lead them into a nightmare of unimaginable terror. The house, seemingly ordinary at first glance, held dark secrets buried deep within its walls, secrets that would slowly, but inevitably, begin to unfold. When the Smurls first arrived, they were a hopeful, young family eager to settle into their new home. The house had been built in the 1920s, with a quiet charm that seemed ideal for raising children. It was in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by trees and greenery, the perfect setting for a family. But the previous owners had left without any explanation. No one knew why, and that should have been the first clue. But the Smurls, excited by the prospect of owning their first home, brushed it off, unaware that they were stepping into something far darker than they could imagine. Their new life started smoothly, and everything seemed fine at first. But then, the strange things began to happen. Little things at first. Doors that creaked open at night. Cabinets left slightly ajar without explanation. The air in certain rooms felt inexplicably cold. It wasn't until the first truly horrifying incident occurred that they realized something was terribly wrong. The first true sign of something sinister came one evening when Janet Smurl went to bed. She described the sudden, overpowering stench as decaying meat, thick and putrid, filling the air as if something rotting had taken root in the house itself. No matter how many times they cleaned, the smell would return, sometimes in the middle of the day, sometimes in the dead of night, without any apparent source. It was overwhelming. Janet tried to trace its origin but failed. The smell seemed to come from the walls themselves, making the entire house feel suffocating. It's like the house was breathing, Janet later recounted. I felt like I was suffocating with it. But the smell was only the beginning. Janet's discomfort soon turned into fear as the house began to reveal even more disturbing secrets. It wasn't just the smell that filled the air. It was an oppressive, sinister presence that seemed to hover over the family at all times. And then, the noises started. The first sound they heard was a faint scratching, coming from the walls, late at night. It began as a soft, almost imperceptible noise, just enough to make you question whether it was real. Jack and Janet would wake in the dead of night, hearing what they first assumed were rats in the walls. But as the weeks passed, the scratching grew louder, more urgent, and far more sinister. It wasn't just random noises anymore. The scratching now had a pattern, almost like it was deliberate. Something was trying to make itself known, trying to get out. The noises quickly escalated. Whispers, soft, almost unintelligible, could be heard at night. Sometimes, it sounded like someone was calling their names. Jack, Janet. These whispers would fade in and out, sometimes in the middle of their conversations, other times while they were alone in a room. The family would search the house, but there was never anyone there. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, whispering, waiting. Then came the growls. Deep, guttural growls like an animal, or something far worse, was in the house with them. They were often accompanied by a feeling of intense dread. The walls would shake, the air would feel heavy, and a chill would spread throughout the rooms. The family couldn't escape it. No matter how many rooms they tried to hide in, the sounds and the oppressive atmosphere followed them. As the days passed, the family began to feel the weight of the house's dark presence pressing down on them. The fear began to take hold of them. Janet, Jack, and the children became increasingly on edge. It felt as though the house was slowly closing in on them, trapping them in its dark grip. One night, Jack Smurl awoke to an overwhelming feeling of pressure on his chest, as if something, or someone, was sitting on top of him. He gasped for air, struggling to move, but his body wouldn't respond. It felt like invisible hands were pinning him down, suffocating him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. When he finally managed to sit up, there was nothing in the room. Nothing that could explain the immense sensation of weight on his chest. Jack could only stare into the darkness, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He knew something far darker than just a ghost was in the house. Soon, the physical attacks escalated. Janet was pushed, slapped, and even dragged out of bed by an unseen force. There were marks on her body, deep scratches, bruises, that she couldn't explain. She often woke up to find herself in strange positions, far from where she had fallen asleep. Her fear grew as she felt the invisible hands grab her, pulling her, pushing her, sometimes with such force that she would stumble or fall to the floor. One night, Janet was thrown across the room. Her body slammed into the wall with such force that she cried out in pain. Jack rushed to her side, but there was no one there. No explanation. The room was still. Yet Janet's body was bruised, her head aching from the impact. The family was beginning to feel trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The terror didn't just stay inside the house. Their youngest daughter, Heather, would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming in fear. She described seeing shadowy figures standing at the foot of her bed, their glowing eyes staring at her. She said they were tall, dark figures that didn't belong in the room with her. The poor child would curl up in her bed, too terrified to move, too afraid to close her eyes. Even their dog, a normally calm and loyal companion, began acting strangely. It refused to go near certain rooms, growling and barking at empty spaces. The dog's fear seemed almost more intense than that of the family. It would refuse to walk through certain doorways, as if sensing something that the Smurls could not see. Desperate, the Smurls reached out to the renowned demonologists, Ed and Lorraine Warren. By 1986, the Warrens had already become legends in the field of paranormal investigation, having handled cases like the infamous Amityville horror. When they arrived at the Smurl home, they were immediately struck by the palpable sense of dread that clung to the house like a second skin. Lorraine, a clairvoyant, immediately felt the presence of something dark and powerful. She walked through the rooms with a pained expression, her hands trembling. "This house is alive," she said quietly, almost to herself. "And it's angry." Ed, who had dealt with many malevolent entities before, was equally disturbed. "This is no ordinary haunting," he said, his voice low. "This is demonic. The house itself has become a conduit." The Warrens began their investigation, conducting a series of interviews with the family, setting up equipment to document paranormal activity, and working tirelessly to understand the full extent of the supernatural presence that gripped the Smurls' home. They were certain that the house was not only haunted, it had become the lair of a demon. The couple learned that occult rituals had been conducted there years earlier, and it was clear that these dark practices had opened a gateway for evil. The Warrens began conducting exorcisms. With the help of priests, they attempted to rid the house of the demonic presence. But every attempt was met with violent resistance. Objects flew across rooms during the rituals, windows shattered, and the family was physically attacked. The demon fought back with every ounce of its strength. The entity manifested in horrific ways. Its presence felt as shadows moving on their own, its voice echoing in otherworldly languages that no one recognized. Janet and Jack both sustained injuries during the exorcisms. Jack was knocked unconscious on one occasion, and Janet was thrown against the wall by an invisible force. The family was in agony, trapped in a battle that seemed to have no end. The Warrens, despite their expertise, were unable to fully banish the demon from the house. The psychological toll on the Smurl family was immense. Jack became withdrawn and afraid to sleep. Janet struggled with deep anxiety, unsure of what was real and what wasn't. The children became increasingly terrified, haunted not just by what they saw, but by the emotional toll of living in a house where evil seemed to permeate every corner. The Smurls reached a breaking point. The house had become a prison, and no matter how hard they fought, they couldn't escape the malevolent force that held them captive. Finally, after years of torment, they decided to leave. The move to a new house wasn't just a physical relocation. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim their sanity, their lives, and their peace. The Smurl family never fully recovered from their time in the haunted house. The psychological scars remained, even as they tried to rebuild their lives. Ed and Lorraine Warren continued their work, but the Smurl case remained one of the most chilling and unresolved in their careers. To this day, the story of the Smurl haunting remains one of the most disturbing examples of demonic possession ever recorded. The Smurl family's story continues to serve as a warning that some darkness is too great to comprehend. The question remains, what truly lurks in the shadows, waiting for its next victim?